Okay, so I just wanted to start out by saying how cool I think it is that the Seniors Lodge and the recreation people do this. The work that I do in my day job, it's getting to be a tighter and tighter box and more nonsense and spin, and the idea that people would get together, tell stories, and try and keep alive some kind of stuff that isn't canned nonsense, I really appreciate it. And so I wanted to say thank you for what you do. Long may you run. My story today is about Bert Herridge. He's a guy who would never have survived the world of spin. Modern politics. He was our member of Parliament right here from 1941 to 1968. That is a phenomenal record, unbroken record of public service that spans 27 years. And I doubt if it will ever be met again by anybody from our area, and probably nobody in Canada. You can tell the story a whole bunch of different ways. It's either the story of a marvelous guy who made social democracy his life and his mission, and then was rewarded by you folks, by the citizens of this place, for that commitment by being reelected for 3 decades. Or you can tell it a little different. You can tell the story as a bit of conflict in politics between the left and the middle. That would be the parts that actually... Never mind. Almost slipped into my thoughts. This is a story between the conflict between the left and the middle in politics, and the struggle that went on there for a few decades, and a guy who tried to keep one foot in each side, Bert Herridge. Or you could tell this story as a metaphor for the shift from agrarian, land-based, prairie farm type co-op politics of the CCF to the more industrial, urban, modern politics of the NDP, and a guy who started out on one side and had to try to get to the other side without crashing in the middle. Or you could tell this story as the historical struggle to stop or change or modify and at minimum survive the somewhat wacko idea that was the Columbia River Treaty. And the one fellow in Ottawa who tried to stop that plan, or at least make it so that his people, you, could survive it.
Pick one, Corky.
Say what?
Pick one, Corky.
Okay, I'm going to start with the first one. This is the wonderful guy, the Social Democratic guy story. It's the most straightforward, and it's kind of lovely. It's a story of a guy who went from absolutely nothing to the halls of power in our country and never forgot living here. Bert and his brother and his parents landed in Nelson exactly 100 years ago to this gathering in 1907. Bert was 12 years old. They didn't have any money. His mom had been a lady's maid to a rich person, helping the rich person get dressed, and his dad was an assistant to a guy that made hats. I forget what you call them,
Milliner.
Yeah, they made hats. They saved up all their money in England, and their dream was to move to Canada, and when they came to Canada, they didn't have the slightest idea how to live here, so they stopped in Winnipeg and took this money that they'd earned as being a lady's maid and gave it to one of those land sharks who stands by the side of the railroad and rips off immigrants, and they spent $1,000 earned in nickels and pennies and dimes for 10 acres of bush outside Nakusp. And the land agent said, "Oh, the Arrow Lakes is orchard country. You go there, man." I said, "It's like it's paradise. The apples rolling off the truck." And Bert's dad put up 10 grand, and when Bert was 12 years old, they took the SS Kootenay up the Arrow Lakes to Nakusp to go find this 10 acres of bush that they just bought. His dad was so green that he actually believed the guy on the dock in Nakusp who said, you know, the way to clear land, there's a forest there, and the way to clear it is to get a couple of goats, and they'll eat their way through the forest, and, you know, serious West Kootenay cedar trees. They bought the goats and took them out, and they hadn't even found a place to live yet when the nanny goat drowned in the lake. What do you call the male goat? The buck. He went back to town, and the miners in the Leland Hotel adopted him, and he drank and hung out at the Leland until he Bert's dad never did really take to orcharding, but his mom had good business sense, and she started a boarding house in Nakusp to keep the family solvent, and that worked because Nakusp was the loading point at that time, 100 years ago, for the Galena, the silver that was coming out of Sandon, which would go north by pack trains to Nakusp, and then be met by boats to take the ore away. And so Bert's mom also figured out that the people on the boats needed to eat, so she started a butchering business. In between running a boarding house and a butchering business, they started having a little money, and then Bert's dad learned how to paint houses. And so the family kind of cobbled together enough money to send Bert to college. And when he was 15, they sent him off to Ontario to Guelph in agriculture, because they had to raise somebody that knew how to grow apples after they. Anyway, when he was 15, they sent him to Guelph. Unfortunately, he had lied about his age, and when the university found out 2 years later, they kicked him out, and so our MP, Bert Herridge, had 2 years of college before it ended in an unfortunate way. And this thing is over. Craig, you want me to shout? Is it back on? When Bert came back from getting kicked out of Guelph to Nakusp, it was just in time for the outbreak of the First World War, which was August 4th, 1914. Just about every young man in Nakusp volunteered to go and fight the First World War. They tended to be kids whose parents had come from England, and the culture was, well, if England is at war, we want to sign up and go and defend England. 1 year later, by the fall of 1915, Bert Herridge was no longer living the happy-go-lucky life of a young man in Nakusp. He was sleeping in a trench in France, and living with the horror of trench warfare and watching his mates become ill or get shot around him. On the morning of November 18th, the Canadians attacked the German line. Bert was injured in that attack, retreated. A doctor who belonged to the Army, actually from Revelstoke, patched him up, and he went back into the fight in the afternoon, and this time he was shot. He got shrapnel in his arm and almost died. The Canadians were losing the struggle. They had to retreat. He stayed in the no man's land between the trenches, and when nighttime came, somebody went out and carried him out on their back. He went to the hospital in England, and they saved his life. He had the good sense in England to do what every 23-year-old guy would do if you got stopped being in war. He fell in love with the nurse in the hospital, and her name was Ella, and she agreed to come back to Nakusp and start a life with him, and they got married in July of 1917. Now, 1918, Bert and Ella moved from Nakusp to Vancouver because Bert needed further medical treatment for the shrapnel in his arm. They spent 1918 in Vancouver. In Vancouver, 1918 was a real important year in the politics of Vancouver and British Columbia. That was the year when Canadians began to be somewhat sickened by what they were seeing about World War I, and to figure out who was making money out of their kids dying, and they started calling it the Profiteers' War. That was the year that the miner, Ginger Goodwin, was killed on Vancouver Island, just out behind Cumberland. And that was the year of Canada's first general strike in the city of Vancouver over the killing of Ginger Goodwin. All this got Bert Herridge to thinking. He's a young guy, and he's a soldier, and he's not a socialist, and he's not a pacifist, but he has seen and lived on the front. And he understood and grew up with miners. And he thought he understood why the miners supported Ginger Goodwin, and he was starting to think about, well, who makes war, and who fights war, and who dies, and who profits from war. I kept on thinking about those thoughts, I think, I would submit, for the rest of his life. He was released from the hospital in Vancouver, and he and Ellen returned to Nakusp, and he became a road foreman, and they started having kids. Now, after the war, as soon as the war was over, you need lots of metal to make ships and, you know, bombs and stuff like that. As soon as the war was over, the price of metals collapsed. The mining industry in the West Kootenay began to fall apart. Price of silver went down, price of lead went down, and there was unemployed miners all over the place. And now Bert's starting to think not only about who dies and who profits, but who employs people and who does the work and who profits from the work, and how come we don't take care of them when the work ceases to exist. And so in the early 1930s, Bert's thinking all these thoughts about war and about workers and about mining, and he thinks, maybe I ought to get into a little bit of politics. So he did the logical thing for a young man. He joined a political party. And following sort of in his parents' footsteps, he joined their party, which was at the time the BC Liberal Party. He was a war hero, right? He's a young man, he's handsome, and so they made him their vice president. At 24 years old, Bert Herridge became vice president of the BC Liberal Party. He went off to his very first convention, and at the convention, at his first convention, the Liberal Party of British Columbia passed 3 resolutions. 1, we believe in the nationalization of the banks. 2, we want Two, we believe in unemployment insurance for all workers. And 3, we want a provincial-run health insurance scheme for all British Columbia. So Bert returned to the Arrow Lakes from the convention, and he was thrilled. His generation was making a change. And then there was an election, and he watched the BC Liberal Party put out their pamphlets and make their speeches, and all the motions that they had passed at their convention didn't even exist in the Liberal Party platform, because of course the folks who actually ran the deal didn't want to do what the party members had agreed to, and it kind of made him grumpy, and he started rethinking this deal of politics. While he was rethinking this thing of politics, somebody gave him a book, something called the Regina Manifesto. And he started thinking about this fledgling agrarian organization, the CCF. And after he joined the CCF, Bert became immersed in reading and going to little meetings, and he found out that while the Liberal Party was about conventions in Vancouver, the CCF was about endless meetings in people's kitchens and talking forever and reading all kinds of stuff, because you had to understand what they were talking about. But he kind of liked it. In 1935, he ran for office as a CCF candidate for the first time. Now, while Bert might have been experiencing sort of a, what do you call that? Bert was evolving as a human being. I forget the proper word, but anyway, he's evolving. If I can remember the word, I can do it. Anyway, he was evolving as a human being. And so he was thinking about war, and he was thinking about how to run a country and everything. But his parents, of course, they were still the people that they were raised in England. So while Bert was out running to be your MP in 1935, his dad followed him around from town to town. Bert get up and give a speech, and then his dad get up, and his dad would say, I don't want you to listen to my son, Bertie Willie. I don't want you to listen to all the Tommy rot he's peddling. He's mixed up now with the ragtag and the bobtail in this constituency. Surely all of you know that he was hit in the head there in the battle. And after he was hit, he's never been responsible since, and that's why he's hanging out with this CCF outfit. And Bert's dad managed to beat him, too. They lost that election, and in 1940, Bert tried again, and of course he ran for office, and this time his dad stayed home, but he lost anyway. Finally, in 1941, Bert had an idea. Well, if I can't win, go to Ottawa, maybe I'll go to the provincial government in Victoria, and he ran for a provincial office with the provincial CCF. And that time, because of his support for miners, and because the provincial riding at that time took in Roslyn and Trail, and Mine Mill was there, they elected him to become a provincial politician. Now I'm going to read a little bit to you. Everybody, when they go to Victoria for the very first time, when they sit in the legislature, they're allowed to make their first speech. And in the first speech, it's quite cool. Nobody's allowed to heckle. Once in your life, you say anything you want, and they can't yell at you. It's a trick to to make you like it. So in his very first speech, Bert described what he believed in. He said, I am a practical evolutionary revolutionist. I am a revolutionist because I believe a fundamental change is necessary before people can have real economic security. And I'm an evolutionist because I believe the people of Canada can express their desire for those changes through democratic process. Thus did Bert Herridge, I think, say what it is that where he was trying to go and deny the power of the gun to get there and ask that democracy make those changes. So in 1944, there's Bert and Victoria, now there's another federal election, and this time Bert's a little bit famous, and so all the people of the West Kootenay, they go, wow, we would really like to run Bert to go be our federal guy, even though he's lost twice. So they nominate him to run for federal office, but there's a rule in the provincial CCF that you can't run for federal office, and Bert says, well, gee, the folks at home, they really want me to do this, so please let me go do this. And the provincial CCF responded by throwing him and everybody who supported him out of the party. Bert didn't really like that, and being a person from the West Kootenay where you make trouble wherever you can, he ran anyway. Bert ran under the title of the People's CCF and beat the regular CCF and the Liberals and everybody else and became your MP. And then, of course, when he got to Ottawa, they figured out, well, he won, and so they capitulated, then he got back into the regular CCF. Bert won this riding as the People's CCF, he won it as the CCF, he won it as the NDP, and then he won it when the party, the NDP, did well and won 28 seats, and he kept right on winning, as you said him there, when the NDP crashed and had only 8 seats, and even the leader, Tommy Douglas, lost his seat. He used that job as MP to fight against arrogant banks, against lousy employers, against undemocratic unions, and corruption wherever he found it. It didn't matter to him if it was the Royal Bank or Hal Banks and the Seafarers Union. If regular people were in a jam, he fought for them. His greatest fight, though, was for the people that lived right here and for the land that he loved, and as it turned out, even for his home. When the Columbia River Treaty proposed to wipe out tens of thousands of acres of forests and communities and farms and homes and villages on the Air Lakes. He fought that fight for us from 1949 when Kaiser Steel, that's a company I think from Oakland, California, they built ships. Anyway, Kaiser Aluminum decided to put a dam in Castlegar in 1949, and Bert Herridge started fighting the plan. Later on, the government of Canada, Lester Pearson, decided to do it and signed it into treaty on July 10th, 1964, at which point Bert retired from politics and went home to Nakusp and died in 1972. Now that's version 1, where he elected a social democrat who stuck to his values and fought all the way through. Now I'll give you the more complicated version, as fast as I can. In this version, Bert's ideas and values actually never did quite fit in with anybody's political party. Hard to imagine, eh? I have to admit that I never knew Bert or Ellen Herridge, although I've known some of their kids and their kids' kids' kids. And they might even be here, or you folks know. I moved to the Kootenays, in fact, the very year that Bert Herridge died. And then in 1985, the MLA for the Slocan Valley and various places said he was going to resign. And the night that he announced that he was going to resign, I'm just at home in Winlaw there, and the phone starts ringing. And people phoned me up and said, would you run for the nomination to be MLA? I was flattered, of course, anybody would be. But I was also confused, because the people that were phoning weren't like exactly my really close friends. They tended to be people who were 20 years older than I was, and in some cases I had never met. Only one, Bob Cunningham, was a real close friend, and it's taken me 20 years to try and figure out what those people that were phoning that night really had in mind. Bob Cunningham, I later discovered, had been Bert Herridge's driver during all those elections. And Erling Johnson, another person who phoned that night, he was Bert's business partner in a sawmill in Nakusp. Essentially, Bert Herridge had always been a little bit sideways from the parties that he belonged to. And his idea of agrarian socialism had not much in common with the urban and eastern Canadian point of view of how to run a political party. When the CCF threw Bert out, they claimed it was just because they said that you weren't allowed to run for federal office. But in fact, the more complicated part of the story is that they threw him out because they figured he was a commie. Bert liked anybody who stood up for working people, and in the early days in this area, that tended to be the Communist Party. They tended to have May Day picnics in Trail every year. Communist Party would get speakers up there, and the only CCF member in Canada who would attend was Bert Herridge, and that made the CCF a little bit grumpy. When they put up a candidate against him, they of course said that it was because he wasn't supposed to run for federal office, but the president of the CCF in British Columbia said in the newspaper, Mr. Herridge may masquerade as a federal candidate for something called the People's CCF, but he in actual fact will be the spokesperson for the Canadian Communist Party. One thing you can say about everybody in this room and everybody who lives here and everybody who sticks it out through the winter is we don't really like other people telling us what to do. So that didn't affect getting him elected, but it certainly turned some parts of his party against him. Later, when he supported the mine mill union in Trail, in raids by the Steelworkers Union, he made an enemy of a famous guy in Canada called David Lewis. That would be Stephen Lewis's dad. And David Lewis had the same opinion of Bert Herridge that the CCFers did, that Bert supported the wrong people too far to the left. And as a consequence, he was already losing the support of the mainstream of the machine by the time the Columbia River Treaty became the issue, and then the Columbia River Treaty was yet another division from him from his party. The CCF was an agrarian party. It was a land-based party and understood sort of cooperatives and looking after farming people and people's desire for community and home. And as it morphed, as times changed and we industrialized Canada, it morphed into the NDP, and the NDP was more of an industrial party, more of a factory-based, more workers organized to produce goods. The CCF was against the Columbia River Treaty. The NDP wasn't so sure. It was going to make cheap electricity, make it easy to build sawmills and mines and industrialize British Columbia. And once again, Bert Herridge had one foot in each side and made those people grumpy. Now, when Bob Cunningham and Erling Johnson and those guys phoned me up and said, why don't you run for this position? I originally thought, that was because they actually thought that I had something to offer. As it turned out what they were looking for was as blank of a canvas as they could find. They'd been grumpy ever since Bert quit his job, and they were looking for somebody who knew nothing, into whose brain they could put the values that they thought they had learned from Bert Herridge. That turned out to has nothing to do with flattering at all. It had to do with ignorance. So Bob Cunningham set out to teach me what Bert thought. One time, as Bob was driving me around, Bob, he wouldn't make phone calls and stuff envelopes. He just said, I'll drive the car. And that was the only thing he would do. And of course, he won't drive the car in order to talk all the time while I drive along and listen to what I said and then correct me afterwards. One time, we were running for office at the very first election, one that I, like Bert, lost. And I said something unkind about the dear social creditor candidate that I was running against. And Bob was livid. And after the meeting, he took me aside and he said, we don't do it that way. You are running on your ideas. And Bert would never denigrate the other guy. And you won't either while I'm driving the car. Or you don't get to go home. We did that for 3 elections. Anyway, one time, another election, I think that we might have won this one. Right in the middle of the election, it's touch and go, and I'm going to go to Nelson. There's 10,000 people in Nelson. That's where the majority of the voters are. You can talk to more people outside the grocery store than anywhere else. And Bob says, "Oh no, we're going to go to Beaton. Tomorrow we're going to Wild Horse Creek." And I'm going, Bob, look. There aren't any votes in Beaton. There's hardly anybody lives there anymore. And he would say, an election is as much about learning about the land and the people who live on the land and the history of the people who live there as it is about running against the other guy. And if you don't understand the land and the people who live on the land, rather you lose, because if you win, as an ignorant person, you'll be dangerous. So we're going to beat him. And besides, he said, that's the way Bert would do it. Bert Herridge ran for election by essentially visiting people at home, where they lived, and not the spin nonsense that, anyway. Over the years, I came to understand that those old-timers had essentially chosen me simply as a blank canvas on which they could paint their memories of Bert Herridge. I think that we all benefit from what they were trying to say, which is that we must never lose our agrarian sense of what we're about. Those old-timers were hugely uncomfortable with what they saw as the Americanization of Canadian politics, and they saw Bert Herridge as the last guy that they knew who fought against it and said what he thought instead of the spin that people wanted to read in the newspaper. All but four of those people now passed away. Those folks who phoned me that night, those folks who wanted politics in Passmore to be more like the socialism espoused by Bert Herridge than anything they saw today. And I think that there's a bunch of questions for those of us who are still here. Number one is, do we remember who they were, and do we get it, how we got here, and how the benefits of living here were achieved, and who fought for them? And another good question would be, and I struggle with this all the time, with the ideas of those people who built our political reality, can they be made relevant in the world that we presently live in? And lastly, and I see there's little kids in the back, and that's, can we pass it on? Will it die with us? Thanks for listening.